Hey there, it's Olivia Savannah here from Olivia's Catastrophe, and today I'm here to give you a recent reads video where I talk about 10 of the books that I have recently read. I'll have content warnings in the description box down below if that's something you might need, but without further ado, let's get right down to the books. The first book, we're going to start on a very positive note here, is Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks, which I absolutely adored and loved, and I gave it 5 stars, and this became a new favourite. Now, I listened to this via audiobook rather than reading it physically, and that is absolutely the way to go if you have any interest in reading this book. The audiobook is fantastic. We've got a narrator who does all of the accents because the people in this book speak in patois, and it covers all of the patois that the characters are speaking. It's also a book that is heavily imbued and about music, and rap music especially, and the raps are in there, they are rapped, and there is musical beats over the key elements or points in the story where music is relevant. And so I loved the production on this audiobook. 10 out of 10. What a fantastic reading experience. Now, in this book, it's about a woman who lives in Bristol, in like historical Bristol, so a couple of years ago, and the policing in the neighborhood has really ramped up. She is black and she's just trying to make it through the day. She just wants to hang with her friends and make her music and try and break into that business, but instead it's about being over policed and how it's driving everybody out of the area. Gentrification is happening in front of her very eyes, and the violence is reaching a boiling point when we start this novel. I adored it. I loved Yimei as a main character. She is someone who is open, but she's so close at the same time. She is open to her friendships. She is open to her family. She is just trying to pour into the world the happiness that she feels when she listens to music and mind her own business. But what she is close to is that she's really scared of love. She's really scared of opening herself up to other people, and she's really scared of the changes that are happening within this town that she's grown up in and knows like her second skin. And so as the events of this novel happen, you feel so much for her as a main character. You feel that grief, and I feel like this book is largely about grief. They are grieving the home and the community that they knew before it got over policed, before people were starting to be driven out. They are grieving the culture that they feel like they don't entirely get to know, as they are diaspora or second generation, that they don't get to visit because they don't have enough money to, that they don't get to entirely involve themselves into, while they still celebrate the culture that they've created as a diaspora for themselves within Bristol where they live. There's also this element of grieving for certain people, which you'll get to know a bit more as you read the novel, and I think that depiction of grief just felt so raw and so true, and it spoke to me in so many ways. But not only how grief happens at a certain point and you grieve then and there, but also how grief dictates or affects the choices that you make in your life following it. And yeah, this book discussed and handled all of that really, really well. I felt the music in my bones while I was listening. I think music is a great passion of mine that I do mention sometimes randomly here and there on my channel, and I don't think I've read a book that incorporates it to the degree where I really understand it and I really see it, and it just felt like a natural extension of Yimei's character, but also the cultural depiction in this book. I also read All Systems Red by Martha Wells. I finally read the Murderbot book that everybody loves. It's about a robot who is there to protect the people that they go on these missions with. This robot has hacked his governor module and has gained sentience. And what this robot wants to do with his sentience is just watch entertainment programs all day. But the mission that the humans he needs to protect are on goes horribly awry, and it is the one who has to step up and take care of these humans. I really, really enjoyed this. I struggled a little bit at the beginning because the Murderbot has gained sentience but doesn't necessarily just gain a personality. It gains its personality and its way of speaking and what it likes and what it doesn't like over the course of the novel, and so you definitely get character development because the robot is processing their whole personality. So that's definitely character development for sure. I also really liked the sci-fi elements to this. I think it did the world building very quickly and easily. This is a novella, so I was impressed by how easily I sunk into what happens in this world and how this robot works. It was seamless for those who are scared of sci-fi and are not big sci-fi fans but read fantasy, never fear, you'll be able to understand everything going on in this. It had cozy elements while still having a plot itself, because it did strike up that found family. You do get to see this really tight friendship group between the humans, and then it as a Murderbot kind of on the edge of boundaries of this. And in terms of the humans that you get to follow, I did really like them. I especially loved Mensa. Mensa was my favourite character in this entirely, because she was controlled and clever and smart and knew how to make the right choices as the leader of this group of humans. And yeah, I was happy with the plot. I was happy with the tension that it brought up. I was happy with how it was resolved. I was happy with how it felt contained to this one novella, and the way this ended was quite open-ended in terms of the plot finished and that tied up neatly, but there was plenty more for us to go into with a sequel. So I'm looking forward to continuing this series, because this was just a delight and it was easy reading and fun and nice. And then we come to the book that absolutely took me by surprise and took me by storm, and that is The Road Trip by Beth O'Leary. I read this book in under 24 hours. I could not stop reading. It just took over my life briefly, and so I had to give this book 5 stars, and it did become a new favourite by default from the fact that I hadn't felt that hunger, that clawing need to do only reading and nothing else in a little bit of time, and this book granted it to me. So this is an adult contemporary book with a lot of romantic elements, so I would say it's a romance. It's about this ex-couple who have split up, and they are both travelling to a wedding in 2 separate cars. However, after a car crash, they end up picking up the people in that car. There's the ex-girlfriend with her sister, and there's the ex-boyfriend with his best friend, and they all end up in one car on a road trip with 1 extra passenger to go to this wedding. And throughout this road trip they have a whole host of shenanigans. Everything goes wrong. They're just trying to get to the wedding and step around the feelings that they still feel lingering for each other. There's also flashbacks, so we get to learn why they broke up and why they didn't work out and what happened to lead us to this point. And I just ate it up like a bit of a spoon, just mouthful after mouthful, couldn't stop turning those pages, and I had a jolly good time. However, I just want to clarify here for people who have watched this channel for a while, this is not my usual read by any which way or means. So let me try and explain to you, and just hold in your head that I gave this 5 stars the whole way through. Number 1, these characters are incredibly unlikable. They are toxic and they are terrible people, and I can see that from the get-go. He is struggling with his mental health at the time of their past, but doesn't seem to realise that he is in a bad place with his mental health, and so he is terrible to her, and also is just terrible at being a boyfriend and a best friend at the same time, because of the fact that he's really struggling with a lot of things, and that boy clearly needed to go to therapy and did not even consider it or understand or know that he needed to. He's also a cis white rich posh boy from the upper class, and he treats everybody like a terrible cis white upper class rich boy. So there's that. There's the best friend who's also upper class cis het white and rich, who's even more terrible than the ex-boyfriend and remains terrible in the present timeline, so he's also unlikable. Then there's her, the ex-girlfriend, and in the beginning I felt sympathy for her, but as the book went further on I realised she too needed to be in therapy and was not in therapy. Like, everybody just needed therapy in this book, and she is not entirely guiltless in this situation and what happens. So ultimately I think they were just as terrible as each other really, and I didn't like any of the characters, and yet I was riveted and reading and wanting to know how their story would end. Secondly, I don't actually ship the romance. I don't actually want in my heart for them to be together at the end of the book. I never really felt like I was behind their romance. They were just equally as terrible as each other, and they both deserved each other for that reason, but I wasn't like, woohoo, can't wait to see them get together. That was never a thought that crossed my mind while I read this whole book. At the end, you know, it's a romance book. There's pretty much a guaranteed happily ever after. My heart did melt a little bit, but at no point did I actually root for them to reach a happy ending. So that's that. This is a romance book. I will say my favourite thing about this was the wedding shenanigans, and when we reached the end the wedding shenanigans came to a head and came to a boil, and I like that even though this book was really talking about mental health and this romance and how they got to be where they are, it still had time to do the wedding shenanigans. I appreciated that it had that balance. This book is over 400 pages long. I say a romance book needs to be about 250 to 300 at a stretch tops. So usually I would complain about the fact that this book is 400 pages and no romance needs to be 400 pages. But again, I just sat there and I soaked it up and I didn't want it to end. And so I appreciated every single one of these 400 pages, I must admit. And so I cannot really complain. I try my best to think about why I loved this book as much as I did, and I do not think I could put my finger on it, and so this is a very unhelpful review for that reason. But just know that you are going to be strapped in for a ride where there's going to be plenty of humour, there's going to be plenty of terrible people doing terrible things, and you probably won't be able to stop reading, and you will be along for the ride that Beth O'Leary sets you on. I loved it. I give it 5 stars. I'm very curious to read more Beth O'Leary and to see if she can do it again, because this was the first book of hers that I read. Moving on, I read The Unworthy by Agustina Bazterrica, which is her upcoming new horror novel, which is translated into English for the very first time. This one is a post-apocalyptic horror novel which is set after climate change has ravaged the world, and we're following this woman who is part of this religious fanatical cult, and we discover what the cult does, why they do that, and over the course of the novel we just follow everything coming to a boil. I thought this was fine and okay. This was one of those situations where I absolutely loved the vibes but not necessarily the story. So when I say the vibes, it's because Agustina Bazterrica knows how to write a very good novel. Her writing style is beautifully, impeccably horrifying in the very best way. It is unsettling. There's a lot of insect horror in here, and there's a lot of religious imagery horror in here, and there's also a lot of self-harm horror, so just be prepared for that. Check your content warnings for this book, please, because it is intense. But all of that horror and all of these descriptions and writing and language kept me on the edge of my seat. I could not stop reading because it was like watching a train wreck unfold. It was disturbing. That unsettling feeling was weighing on my skin. I could not shake it off the whole time I was reading this book. Fantastic. The dystopian world elements are there as well. This is also sapphic, so at some point you do get to see a sapphic romance throughout the course of this novel. But ultimately, even though I loved all those parts of the story and all those elements, I really struggled with the fact that I don't think this really had that much of a plot. There is a climactic moment, but it didn't really have the build to it to pull it off, and I don't think the ending was as satisfying as it could have been if there had been more of a plot line strung through this, and if I'd felt more connected to our main character, because even though we're reading this within diary format, I just didn't really feel for her that much, because she's not really talking about her emotions here. She's more so talking about surviving the horrors that she has to survive day to day. So while this lacked to me in plot and characters, I do think the vibes are really good, and so it ended up being a mixed bag read for me. And actually, I have a similar story and similar thoughts on The Mermaid of the Black Conch by Monique Roffey. This one is a literary book that was Costa Book of the Year in 2020, and it's about this black mermaid who is reeled in by these fishermen who live on a small island set somewhere vaguely within the Caribbean. And they haul in this mermaid, and slowly this mermaid turns into a human and has a love story. Now again, what I really liked about this one is the writing and the language and the vibes. It's written in a way where you really get that sense of the small town community that live on an island, which is just enclosed and it's full of black people, and it doesn't take the time to explain why they speak patois or why they act the way they do. You just get on board with it as you read the book, as you sink into the setting and the language. And I really like the fact that we have a bit of a play around with the wording. When you are reading from the mermaid's point of view, it's written in free verse, and when you're reading everybody else's point of view, it's written in prose like normal. And I liked that distinction, that foreign element added to when you get to hear from this mystical mermaid. However, I do think that I really struggled to get behind the love story, and it just made me uncomfortable. And that's largely to do with the way the mermaid and the woman as she becomes is described, because when she becomes a human, she doesn't really know how to walk, she doesn't know how to do anything, so she has to be taken care of, but she's still a woman. And the way they describe like her body and how sexual they feel towards her, and there is sexual assault in this one, it just really came across as disgusting, because they also describe her with such juvenile language and terminology. So seeing that blended with the sexual attraction they feel to her, and then to be getting behind that love story afterwards, was really, really difficult for me, and it just made me uncomfortable and I really couldn't do it. So I wasn't a big fan of the romance, and I do think this just kind of ended and stopped without much of a conclusion. Ultimately though, I was trying to think, what is my takeaway message from this book? And I think my takeaway message is that girl on girl hate happens, which we all really know, but it didn't really offer us a new perspective. It didn't really show us how it could have changed after all of these years. And I'm not saying you have to have a message that your book needs to align with my thoughts, but it's just not really a message I get behind, and it left me feeling a bit unsure if that was the message I was supposed to get, because it was quite wishy-washy in terms of messaging and thematic clarity. So yeah, it was a bit of a mixed bag reading experience for me, again, with this book. I then read a poetry collection, and this is Forest of Noise by Mosab Abu Toha. This is by a Palestinian poet who was living in Gaza, and it's about some of the atrocious acts that he witnessed during the genocide. He also had a library full of books there that was open to the public, which got bombed, and it ended with the poet fleeing for his life with his family. I tell you all of this because that is integral and important background to this poetry collection, because it is about the genocide that is happening in Palestine at the moment of me filming this, and it is about the horrors, the everyday horrors that he experienced, that people are experiencing and have to see. The poetry collection opens with a quote from Audre Lorde, which is "Poetry is not a luxury," which is taken from her essay titled the same thing. And oh my goodness, is that the most accurate opener for this poetry collection, because none of this poetry is a luxury. This poetry was emotionally brutal to read because it just eviscerates you as you understand the reality and the emotional experience that some people are going through, some kids are going through, some adults are going through, some women are going through, some men are going through at this current time, just for being who they are and where they are. And that is despicable and atrocious, but also poetry is just such an emotional medium that when you read this, you feel all the more of that sense of hopelessness, of that sense of guilt, of that sense of lack of understanding of why this is happening to these people. And it's all the more emotionally painful and heartbreaking because of the fact that this is living poetry. Every time I was taking a few seconds, a few minutes to read and process one of these poems, I was like, someone's living that right now. Someone is living this reality that I'm reading about right now as I sit in the comfort of my home and read it. And so I think this is just an incredibly riveting and well done poetry collection, but also just one of the most important books that you can read right now. If you want to read it but you're worried about the level of poetry because you're not a natural poetry reader, hi, I'm Olivia Savannah. I'm an experienced poetry reader. I've read poetry for many years, and I think this is incredibly accessible. You don't need to be a poetry whiz. You don't need to understand the metaphorical elements of poetry to be able to read and appreciate this. While there are stylistic literary devices used in some of these poems, they're understandable. They're accessible. You'll be able to read this and understand, and I highly recommend you do. It feels weird to call this a new favourite, and I didn't actually rate this because I don't feel like I could, but yeah, I'm going to put the new favourite banner because this is fantastic. Switching vibes here to a young adult contemporary, I read How to Die Famous by Benjamin Dean, and I felt middle of the road about this young adult contemporary. I've got quite a few fantastic books here and then mediocre ones. So this one is a young adult mystery where somebody's brother has been murdered and he becomes an actor in this TV series, which his brother was murdered on that set, to be able to find out who murdered him. And the cast of this all happen to be very black and very queer, and so he fits right in, and it's about him trying to solve that murder mystery while living the celebrity lifestyle for the very first time. What I liked about this was that it was an easy read, it was a fun read, you don't have to think too much about a read. I do enjoy young adult mysteries, and so I was just in for a good time when I read this. What I struggled with is the fact that Abel, our main character, who is doing all of the investigating, is just not a very good investigator. He is not smart about it, he makes very easy and obvious mistakes. He is caught out multiple times, and I just think if you are going to have someone being a detective, you just need to choose someone who actually knows what they're doing. Like, not everybody has it within them to solve a mystery. And so I ended up suspending my disbelief for the fact that I don't think he would have been able to solve this mystery. And also the solution that they come up with at the end is quite far-fetched, and so you have to suspend your disbelief that this would all be able to be pulled off by these young teenagers. I just don't really believe it, and so you've just got to YOLO your way through this book. While it was fun getting to see these teenagers in this celebrity lifestyle, and the celebrity elements do come into it, and the manipulation and the surface level elements and like deception that they have to do for their audiences, it did feel like a very stereotypical depiction of what celebrity culture life is like. So you got to take that with both sides to that coin. And I read it and it was fine. There's multiple points of view in this. I like that there were multiple points of view. I think it gave the story more depth. Simultaneously, I also felt like the points of view weren't that different from each other, and therefore they kind of blended together in my mind, and I really had to pay attention. Otherwise they could have just as easily been in any other character's head. It was a good way to spend the time, but not really a long time. I then read Guillotine by Delilah S. Dawson, and this book was pitched to me as The Menu meets Ready or Not, both horror films, and this was exactly that. You follow a thrifty fashionista who is dating this man so that she can get closer to his mum, who owns a fashion business, a fashion line, and she gets invited to their island that they own for dinner, and so she goes. But what she doesn't know is that this family treat the staff worse than slaves, and they've decided to revolt and murder the rich family, and it just so happens to be the night that she is there. I think it was a lot of fun. I think ultimately, if you like horror, if you don't mind body gore, you're gonna have a very fun time with this revenge novel. The murders were murdery, and they were detailed, and they were gory. They're not for the faint of heart, and I chuckled my way through them because they just felt like the ultimate comeuppance for the horrible characters in this book. I do think that it could have been even better if we'd seen flashbacks of why the people deserved the comeuppance that they got, the revenge that was happening. And while the story does tell you, so don't worry, it's not like you're missing out on this information, the story does tell you, I'd rather it was shown to us, because then I would have felt even more emotionally invested and even more on side of the people committing the crimes for the way that they've been treated and the justice that they receive through doing this, because I would have experienced it along with them in that flashback scene, if that makes sense. So I enjoyed this and I had a good time with it, and it was a fun time, and it's also a very quick read at 200 pages. I just think I would have been even more enamoured if we got that little bit of detail. Also at the end it throws in a couple of questions here, and the characters didn't really want to know the answers to those questions, so we never got them, but I did. I wanted to know those answers. That said, I did read this in a day because I just whizzed through it, I was addicted to it, and I really just enjoyed it. It's such a fun horror read. We have one more poetry collection, and that's ... so ellipses in brackets, and this is by Fady Joudah. So this is by a Palestinian American poet, and yes, I'm on my poetry reading spree and I've read quite a few Palestinian poets at the moment. I enjoyed this poetry collection. Again, a lot of it is about the conflict that is happening in Palestine, but also this one takes it back. This takes it into the history. This is showing the echoes of how the conflict and the genocide that is happening now has been happening for many, many, many years. And I liked that it talked about that long progression of the timeline and the long progression of the history, in case anybody was under the illusions that this is a new conflict. That's not the situation here. And this poetry collection correctly shows that. It's also heavily imbued with a lot of emotion, because you do know again that this is a living poetry collection. I loved a particular poem in this. It's called Dedication, and that poetry collection, that poem in this collection was absolutely brutal. The whole thing could have been that poem and I would have been, you know, flabbergasted. I'm just going to read you a couple of lines randomly from that poem because I think they're very powerful. To those with dementia, may it save you from the full scale of terror, to forgetfulness when a mercy, to remembrance with a mercy, to crutches and wheelchairs, to those who composed songs and sang them to the syncopated thuds of annihilation, to life, to light, the light is dead, long live the light, to those who prayed in the pitch-black night to the power of God, the only power available to them, but could not meditate on moon and stars, to those who found a way to fall in love, make love, construct a romance, a secret rendezvous, hold a wedding and dream of moon and stars, to those who insist on homing their pigeons during the war, have your pigeons come home? To those, to those, to those, we are not afraid of love from the river to the sea. That's just a part of a multiple page long poem that's called Dedication, and it's fantastic and it's painful to read. Again, it's just painful, but it's the kind of pain that we should all be enduring, because there is a lot more pain being experienced right now than what we are experiencing reading a poetry collection, and it will move you. It will move you. I would say this one is a bit less accessible than Forest of Noise. I do think Forest of Noise is where you should go if you're a complete poetry beginner, but if you've read some poetry, or if you're ready to tentatively tackle something a little bit more on the metaphorical side, you'll be able to appreciate these poems as well. I wouldn't say that it's super difficulty level for poetry, like if you're a middle poetry reader or just like a beginner who's branching out, you can definitely read this collection. If you're a beginner of poetry, there are some poems in here which I think you'll be able to understand easily, but some might take you a little bit more work, a little bit more paying attention, if that is helpful to know. We're going to pivot completely, so let's just take a breath as we change tone. For the last book of this wrap up, I am going to be talking about a Sarah Simone novel. I'm going to be talking about Honeycut by Sarah Simone. I have been reading and loving Sarah Simone this year, and this book is the second book in the Lioness trilogy. The Lioness trilogy is a steamy Tristan and Isolde retelling set within a sex and kink club. We are following three characters: Mark, who is the one who owns the sex and kink club and does a lot of secret work on the side. We're following the person that is called Isolde. I don't want to spoil the first book, so I won't tell you too much about Isolde, but there's Isolde. And then there's also Tristan, who is Mark's bodyguard and is just there to do whatever Mark wants him to do. I love it. I love it so much. I give this book 5 stars. It became a new favourite. I zoomed through this in a single weekend and I had a great time. The first book in the series ends in a cliffhanger, and this book picks up that cliffhanger and just doesn't let it go throughout the whole novel. The stakes are high, and the stakes are high in 2 different ways. Firstly, the romantic stakes are high. The cliffhanger from the previous book had to do with the romantic states. This book has a lot to do with cheating and why people cheat, what drives people to cheat, and it really investigates that cheating. It's not like, here's cheating, it's bad. It's like, this is how they got to this situation. I'm trying not to spoil anything. And the fact that it includes cheating to some degree and extent is because of the original legend, and it's keeping those retelling elements. Simultaneously, the other strand to this is also the plot. There is a plot going on in this. This plot involves being a double agent and spying and also political situations, so there is a plot for you to get invested in beyond the steaminess of the romance. But both of these plot lines kind of fuse and integrate, which is my favourite thing in a romance, where the actual plot line and the romance plot line tie in together in some which way or form. There's a bit of polyamory in this one as well, so this is where it gets a bit murky between choosing to use the words cheating and polyamory. It's all kind of tied together in this one, and it gets very confusing and murky, and I just want to say it here in case somebody's put off because of the cheating. I don't think this is a book not to read for that reason, because a lot of it has to do with trying to work out polyamorous feelings as well. Please be aware of the steam level. This is all the way up. It's BDSM, polyamorous, threesomes galore, sex club, kink, shenanigans, steaminess, and it's amazing. Sarah Simone really knows how to write them. You will just, you know, when I was turning the pages, I actually felt my fingertips like burning a little bit from the level of steam that was just coming off this book. Yeah, that's the level of steam that this book gives you. It gives you fantastic characterization as well. I fully got to understand and see why Tristan and Isolde make the decisions that they make throughout this novel. And Mark has kind of been an enigma, as he is supposed to be in the first book, but in this particular book you get to learn quite a bit more about Mark and see past some of his walls, and I appreciated getting to see that character development woven in to this sequel, and it just ramped up my enjoyment of the sequel all the more. And what is also really intelligent that Sarah Simone does is how she uses the legend. She sprinkles in the retelling elements throughout this, and as someone who has now familiarized themselves with the legend, I can really appreciate the cleverness with which this has been formed and written. I laughed, I smiled, I hid behind my hand and giggled, I had all the emotions while reading this, and at the end I might have screamed a little bit because this one too ends in a cliffhanger, and I have to wait until September 2025 before I'm going to get the outcome of that cliffhanger. Sarah Simone knows how to keep us riveted and hooked, and she has done it yet again. I absolutely love this. It's one of it's close to my heart, and you do get to see cameos of some of the characters from the American Queen series, because this series is actually a spin-off of the American Queen series, which I would recommend. Well, if you want the order of which to read Sarah Simone's novels in, I have a whole video that explains the order you should read them in. Absolute delight. What a way to end this video. We started with a 5-star, we had a 5-star somewhere along the way, and we ended with one as well. So there you have it. Those are all the books that I have recently read. Please let me know in the comment section down below, what was the last book that you could not stop reading? You couldn't eat, you couldn't sleep, you couldn't rest, you just had to read that book? Or are you more responsible than me and you can slow down your reading when you need to? Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to be updated every time I have a new video. And you know what they say, onwards and upwards. Excelsior!
Thank you.